I wanted a place for people to receive authentic guidance and practical ways to awaken. Thought-provoking, paradigm-shifting, and empowering. This is about expanding our human consciousness to create a wave of new possibilities. I'm Dr. Theresa Bullard-White, and this is Quantum Minds TV. Welcome back to Quantum Minds TV, where we take a deep dive into various perspectives on what it's going to take to create a shift in human consciousness. Now, in this episode, we are continuing the conversation with author, master of voice, and angelic emissary, Stewart Pearce. Well, and that brings us also to some of the work that you do, both when you worked with the Shakespeare Globe Theater, as well as much of your work with, people who are on in positions of leadership or needing to be public speakers. And you're this voice alchemist and, this master of how to use the voice in a way that really delivers the message. And, if we go to just for a moment to your time at the Shakespeare Globe, you really helped people, the actors, to not just play a role, but really deliver a compelling performance and, something that moves people. So it was more, I could say, even embodiment, helping them to embody the archetype of the character or even perform like an archetype magic that really brings the presence and the energy and the vibration, the resonance in. And you have kind of carried that over as well, it sounds like, to your work with other people who are very notable people who are also on that world stage in some way, or the CEO in the boardroom who are also trying to deliver their message. So how has voice and your work with them to especially accentuate or really feel into the essence and the archetypal energies that they're wanting to deliver? How do you work with them in that way?
Lovely question. At the core of my work is the belief that sound is at the core of creation. Mm-hmm. And of course, we see this in all of the varying vessels that we relate to. It's the work of science. We talk about the Big Bang, not the Big Silence, 13.9 billion years ago, whatever it was. The actor, his or her voice is absolutely crucial because it's one of the core mechanisms that they use to communicate the richness of what's going on within to the outside. Many of us who stand on the outside, we see it as performance. The true actor doesn't see themselves as a performer. They see themselves as a player. And that playing is about a deep, deep core reality within their creative energies. It's more about being than doing. The performer does. The player is being. And so it's a conundrum within acting, because obviously acting means action, means doing. So we can use this as a paradigm to understand our own consciousness. But the last thing that we need to do is to do. Otherwise, we just become control freaks and we become burned out and hyperadrenalized. But if we balance doing with being, if we really look for the inner impulse of why am I being this? What do I want to achieve? How does this feel? We move on to a deeper premise and a deeper promise, which is that at the core of great acting is a truth of feeling statement. Mm-hmm. It's all about that in simplicity. That's the thing that magnetizes you, whomever we are, to watching the TV, watching the film, watching the stage performance, watching. And what creates presence within the individual that magnetizes us to them. So what I've done, I'm a behaviorist. I'm a complete autodidact. I've learned this by living and experiencing. And for example, what I mean by that is that in my role, both as training young ones in a conservatoire situation, which I did for nearly 20 years, and then graduated to Shakespeare's Globe because it was time to reconstruct the project that was a recreation or a reconstruction, I should say, of what the theatre was about in 1597 that contained the great works of Shakespeare. Now, even in the building of that everything was absolutely organic and in relationship to the times. artisans. So what we did was to find woodsmen and master craftspeople who knew what the techniques were that brought about the creation of that building. There isn't one nail used, for example. All the wood is fitted into mortise and tenon joints. The idea is that although it looks permanent, it can be taken apart at any point and moved somewhere else. So there is the absolute crux of the vital change aspect, or as we see today, the instability of our lives. How do we create flux from permanency?
Mm.
And then we go down to what they were wearing on stage, because there was a tenet in our work, in our constitution, that we would have modern practice productions of Shakespeare and original practice. And I was employed specifically with the view of original practice. Modern practice can do anything, wear whatever clothes and approach the playing of those words and the building of those relationships and situations from a very modern perspective of how we live our lives today. But as soon as we move into original practice, we worked with a master craftsperson or a mistress craftsperson, who this wonderful designer called Jenny Tiramani, who researched the clothes that they wore 450 years ago from the great portraits and found people around the world that still are able to create everything by hand. No Velcro, no zippers. Everything going all the way down to the underdrawers, the undergarments. No Marks and Spencers or Janet Rager. No, absolutely. The fabric that was used was fabric that was worn at that time. All of the dyes were vegetable dyes. And interestingly, most of the time to create the architecture of the way that the women wore their clothes, they would be often pinned into the clothes. And that's one of the reasons why they had this stomacher, which was this wrapped circular piece of fabric around their midriff, which was also a symbol of the divine feminine. And the fabric of the dress would fall over it. So you couldn't put your hands down, otherwise your hands would be sort of like this. You held your hands like so. So you were always in a position of reverence and veneration and prayer.
Well,
It goes right into but you see, we're going back into a culture. This is before the rise of literacy. It's before the noise. It's before the machines. We live through a culture of noise. So no wonder we're running around and talking in our heads like this, because there's so much noise and we want to get over the noise, as opposed to really living in the substance of what is most essential about us, which is our heart and the way that we feel, because feeling is the language of the soul. So by observing, by being, I call myself a behaviorist, because I've sat for hours and hours and hours in rehearsal rooms and other situations, watching people present. And of course, we all know that if we present inauthentically, which we often do because we doubt ourselves, we don't feel worthy, that what we tend to do is we show off and we perform. It's much more difficult, perhaps, because of the way that we've been educated and conditioned, to come deep into the very core of the way that human beings feel in remarkable situations. And that's what makes great theatre. To sum it up, to encapsulate it, it was something that Mark, this extraordinary actor who's considered by his profession as the leading actor of today, Sir Mark Rylance, that Mark is a human angel. And so he and I were able to dance together in the creation of his extraordinary work. And we created together something called the magnetic voice, which he is an extraordinary exponent of. And now making big movies for Spielberg is being sought after by a lot of the American actors who said, how does he do that? What is he? How does he? And I say, well, he's not doing it, he's being it.
Yeah.
Because acting holds a mirror up to nature, do you see? I just looked at the thesis of the experience of what acting is all about, made sense of it, and I take it into other situations, because it's a beautiful paradigm for us all, that we're all living as actors on a stage. But are we living in the performance and showing off and being grandiloquent and egocentric? Or are we actually really living our souls? Are we living the impulse of what our essence is really all about?
So maybe really, like, for anyone who's presenting or delivering, some kind of a message, to, when we're delivering it just from the intellect or just from the mind, it doesn't really sink in and penetrate into the person's being. But when they shift into the heart space, the soul space, and really embody the feeling of it, they be it. Now the energy is delivered, and the message isn't just through the words. There's another essence, a vibration that comes and resonates within the soul of the receivers or the people who are watching this performance. Yes.
I think you've summed it up excellently, rather, and particularly in the token of when they delivered the information. And I would say that we actors, if we're worth our salt, we say we share the information, which is a very different experience. The delivery is an external form. Is this okay? Is this right? And the sharing is, I'm experiencing something here, and I feel that it's quintessential. I feel that I'm given the responsibility of sharing this with you, that by sharing this with you, I may just alter the way you perceive your days. Nice.
Lovely.
And thereby lies redemption, do you see? So the beginning of the play sets up the situation and the complexity. The middle of the play dives into the complexity and sometimes a tremendous amount of psychological dilemma. And then by the time we reach the end of the play, we're literally being lifted up through a process of redemption. Jack marries Jill, and all should be well.
Let's take a pause from this fascinating conversation to enjoy a quick consciousness break.
Oh, hi. Thank you for joining me for this book reading of The Game Changers, Social Alchemists in the 21st Century. This chapter is called Entering the Age of Conscious Evolution. These are remarkable times insofar as the pace of change is speeding up. And just about everywhere we look right now, accelerated change is afoot. What is all this change about? Why now? And how do we best adapt? These are the questions that are explored in this book. We are witnessing the old systems and limiting structures of the previous millennia's outdated paradigms crumbling down around us. And as the old systems break down, people are being stripped of their comfort zones and are rising up in despair and anger. From the heads of governments, to people in the workplace, to children playing on the street, to family matters, and there is a great uncertainty of what tomorrow will bring. And due to the advancements in technology and various social media platforms, there are new and powerful pressures on the status quo, contributing to the accelerated pace of change. Amidst this seeming chaos, there is a light of hope emerging now. As the saying goes, great chaos precedes great growth. Now, the system failure is giving way to a new time of reassessing what is truly of essence. What must we salvage? What is corrupting the system that we must discard? And what kinds of new innovations, methods, and sustainable solutions do we want to replace these with? One of the things that I really want to explore into before our time runs out is that, we've talked a bit about some of the devolution that is happening, the regression, or almost like a retrograde, like the Earth is going into a retrograde itself, like where we're devolving in it. We see it in the entertainment world, we see it in our politics, we see it, in social narratives and so forth. There's like this kind of reversal, devolution that's happening. And, your experience with the Shakespearean work is that it's so archetypally based. And you mentioned that, when any one of us hear like a well-performed Shakespearean play versus what we watch maybe in today's, kind of mainstream live streaming on Netflix, right? The quality they're incomparable. The quality of these more ancient works or Shakespearean times, Elizabethan, Golden Age times, it's so much richer. And today it's just quantity versus quality. And I was I want to talk about that. And I also want to talk about, you had mentioned the 4 archetypes that show up again and again and again in the Shakespearean work, and this sort of evolution that happens through these 4 archetypes. What are those 4? Why are those 4 so important? And how do we evolve through them to come to a state of greater wholeness and embodiment? It's a lot, so go for it.
Well, of course, I love this, and I haven't thought about it for a long time, but I felt myself so steeped within remembering what it must have been like before the noise, what it must have been like before the machines in 1597, when the theatre on the South Bank first opened. Originally, it was in the northern part of the city, still within the city walls, in an area called Shaw Ditch, which is an interesting part of the city of London. And then it was moved by the players, by James Burbage and all his men. And the Lord Mayor of London said that we would go to the theatre to hear the play, whereas today we speak of going to see the play. So we talk of spectators rather than audience. So they heard sound in a different way because noise was not around. I mean, you have the noise of the cartwheel. The noise may be, if we call it, I mean, hopefully it was harmonic, of the church bell, which ordered the day, because nobody wore these things. Or the sundial, etc., etc. They were alive in their bodies and in association with Mother Earth and with the essential medieval belief of the anima mundi, the animating principle of the universe, which of course today we call Brahma or Chi or May the Force be with you. And so the Lord Mayor of London said in 1597, I think his name was Richard Green, all speech is decorated silence. Now, when you think about that, that's extraordinary. And of course, we've all had that experience of being in the depth of nature, and there is no traffic noise or electrical pollution, and we hear our voices in a completely different way, or being right out at sea or on the top of a mountain. It's a completely different experience. So our sound making is uniquely different. We go deep, deep, deep into the visceral experience of what it is to feel and share the way that we feel for the prima motive, the prima generative of our beings, which is to connect and to connect with meaning. And so when you consider that the audience at that time, only an 8% of the population could read. So if we can't read, you hear words in a completely different way because you don't have any word images in your consciousness. You have symbols and illustrations, but it works in a very different way. And of course, there is a magic within Shakespeare's words, which is why we're still speaking them meaningfully, I hope, that spells. We literally become spellbound. And in the practice of working this theatre, we noticed that for the first 10 years of its creation, that our audience would be a population of 93% box office success. And you think, wow, that's pretty good, because the West End was doing something like 35% success through an aggregate of all the different theatres, the main theatres in the West End. And it's only for a 6-month summer season because it's open air and it's too cold to stand there in the middle of winter listening to actors on a stage. I know this because I've done it, because the Globe Education Department would take over for the winter, and I was one of the prime people that were there. Was a whole team of us that worked the vast educational department, where 95,000 school children go through the Globe every year. And then, of course, I would deal with the undergraduates or the postgraduates who were fascinated. I created a conservatory in the theatre for young American actors who would come from Rutgers University in New Jersey and spend 26 weeks or whatever in London working at the theatre. So we begin to realize that there was a totally different experiential about the way that those words worked. However, the paradigm that I wanted to offer was that the majority of their 93% of box office success was based on something like 60% or 65% of foreign nationals who possibly could not understand because they were maybe they had, well, obviously English is a second language, maybe it's a third language, but you're dealing, as you were saying earlier, with heightened language. to be or not to be, that is the question. We don't speak like this today. And of course, it has a certain rhythm, which is the rhythm of the heartbeat. However, how is this useful to us today? So it brings us into an understanding that right at the very core of the success of these spelling plays are a series of compounds. So all of the plays are based on the Kabbalistic tree of life, or the Rosicrucian tree of life, because the people who wrote them, and I don't believe it was William Shakespeare, a humble glove maker from Warwickshire, I believe that William Shakespeare is actually a nom de plume for Will I Am, shaking spear. Will I Am, which is after all what we're doing today. We're learning the great I Am. So I Am is brought about through will. Will I Am. Shaking spear, the image of Pallas Athena, who the goddess of wisdom and the goddess of war, who is always seen with her spear. And so if she's shaking her spear at us, she's wanting to disturb us. If the spear is still and she's smiling, then automatically we feel as though we're being enraptured by the divine. So there are these interesting poetic elements that lie within. And as you were saying, within the body of the writings, not only is there the tree of life, but also there are four essential archetypes that keep popping up: the lover, the warrior, the sovereign, and the magician. And so each person who is significant, meaning each person who is iconic within the play, the major characters, is moving through a sequence of understanding what these roles, what these archetypes reveal to them about their essential consciousness, the totality of the individuation process, as we call it today. So if we relate these to a contemporary frame, such as the young princes, Prince Harry and Prince William and Prince Harry, firstly, they were these beautiful young men, these lovers, and then we saw them join the army and they became practiced warriors, not professional soldiers, but at the core of their work was the understanding of duty, was the understanding of team effort, of being a member within the organism, which is known as the regiment or the battalion or whatever, etc., etc. And then, as we see them now, they're moving into the role of sovereign. They may not have literal crowns on their heads, but certainly we see William being groomed to eventually take over from his father. I think Charles is obviously going to assume he's going to have the crown put on his head, but this is a man that's waited for over 70 years and is not really interested. Is much more interested in how he can heal the planet. So he will use the rope to heal the planet. Harry, on the other hand, has become a displaced sovereign because he's chosen to take his bride to the birthplace of her emission into the consciousness of humanity and find his own kingdom, and is doing an extraordinary job of creating that kingdom through the emancipation and the liberty of all human beings, and therefore moves into the high priestess or the high priest, the magician, becomes truly magical. So that's just a very sort of watered down illustration of how these archetypes keep popping up within the plays, and they are useful to us today. What my great colleague Lynn MacDonald, who is the master of movement, although she's a lady, we were always using the masculine generic, which was based on the fact that in the crafts guilds, the apprentices would be employed at the age of 14, sometimes younger, and they would work for a journey person for 7 years and learn the basic skills of whatever the craft was. And then they would be tested and work for another 7 years on a higher degree. And then they would be tested and they would meet the master and they would work with the master for 7 years. So after 21 years, they could possibly be elected to being a master. So being a master means that you have durability. It doesn't mean that you have a laurel around your head. It means that you just simply have explored moments of downfall and moments of excellence, moments of wrongdoing, moments of right doing, moments of rejection and moments of triumph, so that the skill becomes stronger and stronger and stronger. But all masters, particularly at that time, believed that they had a guardian angel called a genie, and it was the genie that gave them the genius to create. So they were always allowing the excellence of their deliberation, their sharing, their craft skills, their excellence to become part of the divine harmony of the cosmos.
So with these four major archetypes, you said they're a progression for us to evolve towards greater wholeness, integration, mastery. And so do you think you could summarize really quickly, because they also play in our roles, not just in these plays, by Shakespeare. They are, I think he was communicating something to us about the importance of that journey of individuation and self-realization. And if we are all progressing through these four stages, what would be the key lessons that each of those four stages delivers, that it wants us to learn? And then, how can we assess, where am I at with this progression, so that I can also look at where do I need to be so that I can progress forwards and keep moving through the stages?
Well, if we look at the arousal of the contemporary initiate, and when I say that, I mean the person that is awakening to the fact that they have soul, they have spirit, and they wish to live their lives as a spiritual being having a human experience rather than a human being having a religious experience. There is the awakening of the lover, because we begin to realize that there is an intelligence within us and without us that is infinitely greater than we in these 4 school years and 10 that Shakespeare speaks of, except we know that we are part of, divine splendor is within us. So we are stars wrapped in skin. So we become lovers. And then as soon as this takes place, we begin to realize that our ego, which is often caught in glamour in our lover archetype, needs to be exercised, and is often exercised by those people around us, by the communities that we fall into or move into, that we rise into, that we rise to love into rather than fall in love into. And we're challenged. So we have to become warriors, which means that we become spiritual warriors, where we have to be absolutely acute with our own truth and not live out the glamour existence of, oh, by the way, did you notice that crystal? Isn't that amazing? I call that spiritual confetti. It's more about, what does the crystal's vibration help you, rather than acquire, so that I can impress you all. And so as a result of that, we're really exercised. And of course, along comes the shadow complex in the warrior status. So we're taken into the long dark night of the soul. And when we're taken there, it's tragic, and it's visceral, and it's chthonic, and it's deeply disturbing. But of course, along comes somebody who is kind and says, all conditions are temporary. You will get through this. This is an endurance test. Well done. Keep going. Keep going. It's shit at the moment, but just keep going. So we become sovereign. The I am presence brings us into our sovereignty. This is not an idea. This is a literal experience, because after all, in the long dark night of the soul, in the warrior status, we're taken to the very quick of our beings, because we're on the verge of death. It may be moral death. It may be emotional death, because we have to give up the codependency and move away from those people that have been toxic in our lives, even our dear, so-called dear ones, our family. And we realize that our soul family is what we crave, because there we really see and when compromised. So we move then into the ability to bring in the magician. In simplicity, in these few moments of sharing with you, that's what can muster. But you've introduced me to a question that I have never actually been asked before within this contemporary context. I've thought about it, as you can hear, but I've never been asked. So I will think on that, and maybe I can come up with even greater explanations.
Your next book, perhaps.
Maybe. Yeah.
Join us again as we continue to dive deeper into this fascinating conversation with Stewart Pearce on the next episode of Quantum Minds TV.
This Conscious Conversation was created, produced, and recorded by Dr. Theresa Bullard in collaboration with Stewart Pearce and edited by Verse Content and HH Films and Photo. The theme music and intro videography were produced by Tim Mountain of Even Load Productions. Quantum Minds TV is a product of the Quantum Learning Academy.